Welcome everyone to another episode of the You're Better Off Knowing sub-series in Meta's Business Innovation and Technology podcast. This one is called Measurement Frameworks, How to Combine Short and Long-Term Measurement. We will discuss how advertisers and agencies should measure the impact of their advertising across multiple solutions and how to evolve their advertising tactics and strategies for the short and the long term. And I couldn't wish for better experts on this. They are actually legends. We have Les Binet, Group Head of Effectiveness at Adam and Eve DDB, Gordon Black, Director of Paid Media Measurement and Learning at Adidas, and our very own Konstanze Fichtner, Marketing Science Partner and EMEA Lead for Brand Measurement at Meta. Before we start, let's do a quick round of introductions. Maybe Les, you can start and give those in the audience who don't know you yet a quick summary about who you are.
Okay, I'm Les Binet. I'm Head of Effectiveness at Adam and Eve DDB. And so my job is to measure the effectiveness of our advertising and marketing, but also to understand what drives effectiveness and improve it. And I've been doing that for donkey's years, as we say in the UK.
Very happy to have you. Next, we have Gordon Black from Adidas. Gordon, please give us a short intro.
Hey, I'm Director of Paid Media Measurement and Learning at Adidas. I started my career in marketing analytics around 20 years ago, learning the craft of econometrics, then had the opportunity to move client side, working for Sky in the telco sector, really getting opportunity to make sure you drove action for a business. And then I was part of an amazing team there, but 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to relocate to Amsterdam and join this incredible brand, Adidas. And here I am responsible for making sure we learn from every euro we invest and determine and optimize our paid media investment.
Perfect. Great having you. And last but not least, we have Konstanze Fichtner, my colleague in Meta. Most people call her Connie, so we'll do that here as well. Connie, please give us an overview about yourself.
Hi, well, Connie is totally fine. So my name is Connie. I work in marketing science, as Thorsten said. On top of my, day-to-day role, I have a strategic role within marketing science, where I focus on brand and brand measurement. I basically spent also all of my career so far in brand and communications measurement, and I'm very excited to be here today.
Thanks so much. So let's dive into our topic. Today advertisers have plenty of options when it comes to metrics and also to solutions on how to measure them. In terms of solutions, we have marketing mix models, we have attribution, we have incrementality experiments, and privacy standards and cookie deprecation have already transformed some of these solutions, as well as, of course, the rise of AI and synthetic data and measurement. And then there's a lot of debate about metrics and proxy metrics like viewability and attention. And it feels like there's more fragmentation than ever. There's also a WARC Future of Measurement report that found brands are really struggling to keep up with measurement best practices these days. So what does really work in measurement? How do you measure properly? Which metrics matter the most? So maybe Les, we can start with you here. What is your guidance on solutions and metrics?
Well, the bad news is there's no single answer. I think everybody wants to have, like one method, one number, one measurement that you should focus on. And it's not like that. It's like if you were trying to drive a car, you wouldn't want one dial on the dashboard. You wouldn't drive the car by just focusing on speed, say. Ultimately, if you're a commercial business, then the ultimate measure that you're interested in is how much money you're making, how much, what's the effect on sales and profit and so on. But again, there's no one way of measuring that. I would focus on three. So I would look at econometrics or market mix modeling, as many people call it. I would look at attribution modeling, counting the clicks and counting the direct responses. And I would also look at doing controlled experiments. Use all three and use that, as I say, to triangulate the true sort of payback and ROI. Each of them has different strengths and weaknesses. And so you need all three. And then you also mentioned what you called proxy metrics, like attention or whatever. They're not proxy metrics, in my opinion. They are not ways of measuring effectiveness. They're ways of understanding effectiveness, understanding the chain, the causal chain from what you do to the outcomes. So you need those as well.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Gordon, what's your view on it?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, ultimately, what matters to a business is the outcome, and that is long-term sales and specifically profitability of those sales. So everything that comes before that is, has to ultimately ladder up to proving that you're able to drive these outcomes for your business. But everything Liz has said, it's spot on. I mean, first of all, the framework has to include lots of different tools to triangulate and get confidence in your answer. The other thing for me is making sure you're defining success appropriately for what you're intending to achieve. I'm sure we'll talk more about full funnel marketing and full funnel investment strategies, but making sure you've clearly defined with this particular piece of activity, what is my outcome intended to be? Is it intended to drive feelings and desire, or is it intended to drive sales now? Depending where that is in the funnel, you should clearly have defined what success would look like and be measuring in that way.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I really like what you both mentioned, actually, the triangulation between methodologies, which is something that we are very much supportive of as well. Connie, would you like to add something here?
Yeah, maybe just to add. I mean, definitely I agree. There's more complexity or what feels like more fragmentation, which in many cases is actually just having more options to measure as well. So, and obviously what always makes sense when things get more complex is to focus on what really matters, right? And make that the guiding principle. So to Gordon and Les's point about start with business outcomes, right? That should be the guiding principle. Start with business outcomes in mind, and then everything else comes next. And then obviously, I'm a big fan of using different solutions. I think Les already highlighted, like they all have strengths and weaknesses. There's not that perfect solution, right, that we have. They're all like imperfect to some extent. And then when it comes to how we can make the most out of it is by combining them, right, in a like integrated framework. I think that's where we can use them to maximize the accuracy across the different solutions. Obviously, MMM is a great starting point. I think if you have a solid MMM in place that really sets you up for success, for sure, we know that it takes some time to set up a good MMM, but it's absolutely, it's worthwhile doing it. And then also I'm a big fan of experimentation. It's very powerful to optimize on the fly within a specific channel, to really optimize your outcomes, to make sure there's constant and continuous improvement across different media channels.
Yeah, I think a really good point about combining them. I mean, not just triangulating, but actually using linear attribution data as a feed into market mix modeling, and structuring your market mix models in such a way that, for example, if you're doing regional experiments, you can have regional data, and then you use the data that you get from the experiments to maximum effect.
You can even, if you're more advanced brand and you have a good MMM in place that you've been using for years and you run experiments on a regular basis, what you can do, and again, this is definitely a more advanced use case for MMM. You can use experiments to calibrate your outcomes in MMM to maximize the accuracy that you try. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the some of the listeners may know that Peter Field and I wrote a book called The Long and the Short of It, which is about short and long-term advertising effects. And in fact, most of the key ideas behind that book, for me, actually came from working with regional econometric modeling, which had controlled tests built into it. For a very small insurance brand, around about 1995, a small brand called Frizzell. And I like to joke that everything I learned about advertising came from Frizzell Insurance, because what we did was we had a regional rollout of an advertising campaign across the UK across a year, and we had a regional econometric model, which meant we could really get very, very fine-tuned fine-grained measurements of both the short and the long-term effect, and the direct and the indirect effect of this campaign. So, yeah, absolutely. Putting those together, putting experimentation and using it to calibrate your MMM is incredibly powerful. I can see Gordon nodding vigorously.
So enthusiastic. Honestly, it's exactly that. That is, interestingly, through my experience, one of my first real learning moments was in a small insurance brand as well. It's amazing how much joy the boring world of insurance can bring us. No disrespect to people working in that exciting world. But no, absolutely, triangulation and calibration are key. I think the big thing for me is I really want to step back. I've heard both you talk about there's no perfect solution exists. It's like there's no individual tool that is a perfect solution. But honestly, let's be more confident and bold. There actually is a silver bullet. And that silver bullet is a unified and consistent measurement framework. That is where you utilize MMM, but you can't just say use marketing mix modeling, use econometrics. Like anything, there's good and there's bad MMM. And what I'm here to educate on is that good MMM really can be your silver bullet. The way I see this is, people say too often, well, there is no silver bullet to understanding the business. If you've defined your goal, and in my case, that is making sure we understand how our investment works, think how we could optimize it, prove it works again, and keep building and keep learning, then I would say I have a framework that works. Too often, though, however, you're after your silver bullet when the werewolf's running at you. And this is the trouble. MMM does take a really long time to get into place. You have to have melted down your silver long in advance. You have to be calibrating with all these other experiments long in advance. When I was taught the basics of econometrics and doing it well, it's calibration was nothing new. Back then, we DM, robust test and control DM experiments would allow you to calibrate DM into your more traditional MMM model. It's no different now. The principle of that sort of calibration, the ability to do it has radically evolved. Now you're able to use Bayesian priors to make sure it's a more guided form of controlling and calibrating against other factors. But the principle is exactly the same. So first of all, it is a silver bullet. And the reason I really like describing it as a silver bullet is because you get a lot of people telling you should use this new fancy gold bullet. It's shinier, it's better. But a gold bullet doesn't even kill your werewolf. What's the point of it? It might serve other purposes, and we should explore those. But yeah, no, all for using triangulation, MMM, unified measurement framework as your silver bullet.
I totally agree, Gordon. I think I actually prefer to call it econometrics, actually, but because I think it's a bit more specific than MMM. And econometrics kind of goes in and out of fashion. We have an obsession with shiny new things, don't we, in marketing? But basically, the mathematical techniques behind econometrics were, first established a very, very long time ago. Some of them in the 19th century, a lot of them in the 1930s. But the point is that this is proper mathematical science, which it doesn't stop being true, and I think the techniques of econometrics are still as valid as they ever were. There are challenges, and you hit on a really important one, which is that to get basically, if you want to measure everything, including longer term effects, you need long-term models. You can't have long-term effects in a short-term model. And that's a challenge because it means that it takes you some years to get a model properly robust and properly, measuring everything. And we often, advertisers switch suppliers, junk models, do it for a year or so, don't keep updating it. So actually building a long-term econometric model, a fully functioning long-term econometric model, is a big commitment. Not that many people do it.
Thank you. So I think we've learned a lot already. Everyone said you need frameworks, you need to use various methodologies. I also love the silver bullet werewolf metaphor. I will use that in the future. So Les, you already touched about different versions of econometrics, long-term and short-term. In general, marketing mix modeling or econometrics have evolved. So what are the latest development and how valuable and powerful do you think they are, and what has changed?
Well, actually, probably Gordon is more at the forefront of this than I am in terms of the latest developments. But I would just comment on a couple of things. One worries me, which is that over my career, because I've been doing this for 37 years now, and I've seen models become more detailed and more granular, but often more short term. So when I first entered the business, it was quite common to see 5 years worth of data and sometimes 10. And now increasingly we have people analyzing really short samples. And as I say, you can't measure the all important long-term effects in short samples. So that's one thing that worries me. Also, another thing that worries me is sometimes when models become very granular, things disappear. There's a kind of an assumption that the more data you have and the more granularity you have, the better the model's going to be. And in fact, sometimes that's not true, because many of the really big important effects happen at the macro level and become hard to see when you're looking at granular data. It's like you can't see the wood for the trees. So we first started to notice that with looking at promotional activity I think, particularly in the 90s, when as people began to analyze data on a store level, the effects of promotions, which had been hard to see before, leapt out as being really big, because the effects of promotions in the short term at the store level are huge. The effects of promotions at the macro level are small and sometimes negative. So this is a hard thing to get across to people, particularly without drawing some diagrams. But what can happen is as you begin to zoom in on store level data, you start to become more and more obsessed with doing things that produce a short-term hit to sales volume at the store level, but actually damage the brand in the long term at the macro level. So short-termism and excessive granularity are, I think, challenges.
I completely agree with that. And I think this is almost the risk of turning econometrics into the golden bullet from being the silver bullet is play to its strengths, use it for what it's good at. It is an aggregate technique, and it's a fine balance of what's appropriate to apply MMM. I think it's important that we kind of take a step back and talk about the role econometrics plays, and we've already talked about triangulation, attribution as a part to play. I like to step back and apologies in advance. I can't resist another analogy. And the joy of working at Adidas, a wonderful sports brand rooted in football, is people have to put up with a good sports analogy. So if we think about the world of attribution and digital attribution, last click reporting, so often still used. And what I'd say is that sometimes that is fair. If it's used for what it is, it's fine. But in a world of football, that is like crediting everything to your striker just because he scores your goals. Great. We love our strikers. He's the one most people have in the back of their shirt. But ultimately, they rely on other team members to be able to achieve their goals. So then we move into a world of multi-touch attribution, data-driven attribution. It starts to give credit to those that give the assist, the person that passes it through to the striker. Great, we recognise them. However, how many passes do we go back? Do we ignore that build-up actually started with somebody throwing the ball in from the sides? We're still really limited on what we're learning when we look at any form of digital attribution. And then we bring in the world of econometrics. The way I think it's different and comparable to these two is that it's like looking at the full football pitch and kind of saying, we know exactly who passed, we know every part of the build-up play. More importantly, we know all of those runs off the ball, your own teammates that have done a decoy run so that you could pass that ball through. the competitors getting in your way and you having to get around them, the referee having a decision go against you that you don't necessarily agree with. And then critically, the impact of all the external factors, all those fans around you chanting your name or chanting the opposition, whatever that may be, it's like suddenly MMM is something that takes into account all of these factors, which is so complex and so important that it only works at a certain level. Going back to the point, I think we're at risk of applying MMM with some really granular techniques. You lose some of these focus. So it's really clear that we've defined how are we using our MMM, how is it working together. For instance, you do a lot of daily, hourly modeling now with MMM, very regional. And to what Les talked about, it's fantastic, giving you some very granular short-term results, but suddenly you're losing that the woods for the trees and all that.
Yeah.
Suddenly you can't see any of the bigger picture anymore.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish between short-term and long-term in your econometrics, Gordon?
Yeah, it's a great question. We evolved to have kind of three scales of effect. There's pure direct short-term effects. This is measured through MMM, testing lags, decays, typically linear functions on advertising now, driving sales today, tomorrow, the day after that. And these are tested along a wide range of times. So you could have, your very lower funnel branded term search activity that truly is immediate and it's gone, compared to our activity around the Euros this summer, where you'd have out of home advertising around, building up feelings, building up emotions, likely having more of an effect over a couple of weeks, a few weeks. So it's still a direct effect of your advertising. We then test an indirect advertising, which can come in two forms primarily. The fact that all of your activity potentially drives those future searches, so making sure you credit what's actually been driving your search, or also what is it doing for your brand health? Is it driving your awareness, your consideration for your products, general desire? And this is something that some people call this the full long-term effect. I'd still call this a short-term but indirect effect of acknowledging that you are shifting those perceptions now. There's then, this will be nested typically through MMM econometrics, and you're able to quantify that into its impact on long-term sales. But it's still ultimately driving kind of short-term change on a more meaningful mid-term metric. And then finally, we utilize unobserved component modeling to understand what drives those underlying trends in your business, which is so important in a business like Adidas, where a lot of our products are aligned on different seasonality, but also different fashion cycles and fashion trends. It's so important you have a technique that understands how is what you're doing now actually influencing these big effects in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, isn't there?
Definitely.
Yeah, that's really very interesting. Connie, I know, we also released some studies on short and long-term impacts. Maybe you can share a little bit so that the audience also gets an idea of how to quantify the size of these effects.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, definitely. So at Meta, we've really invested into in understanding, the role of long-term effects in advertising, and we ran studies like what we call meta study, not because we're Meta, but because we're looking. It's a study across studies. So because we wanted to really take a really rigorous approach to understanding long-term effects across different categories and countries, is what we did. It's actually a research that we published already in 2022, but I think the findings are still very valid, and it really speaks actually to what Gordon just outlined in terms of the importance of measuring brand and long-term effects. Now, what we found is, again, this is a very comprehensive study across 3,500 campaigns on Meta, but it wasn't Meta only. We looked actually across media channels. Is two things. First of all, but what we found is really the importance of long-term effects and the role they play. That was probably the most striking finding that we got, because across all these different studies that we ran, across the categories, we always found them to be significant on top of the short term, which basically means if you only look at the short term, there is a certain amount of ROI or impact that we're neglecting if we're only looking at the short term. That was the most important finding. And then the size of the long-term effects varied by category. So between 40 and almost 80% for a category like tech and durables, where you have TVs or computers. So it's probably a bit more of a long-term category. So, and apart from that, what we found is that was probably the second most interesting finding that we got is not something that is tied to a specific media channel, if that makes sense. It's something that you can find across the different media channels. So almost all of the channels that we looked at had or drove short and long-term effects. There were some differences, right? But they were found for digital media as well as traditional media. And then the interesting finding was for us, it's whether you drive more short-term or long-term outcomes, less about the specific media channel that you choose. It's more about how you set up the campaign, right? So, and the approach you use in your targeting, in your marketing, the audience you're talking to, the approach you use that defines whether it's more short-term or long-term or even both, by the way. So yeah, we've done a lot in that respect, so that research is available and hopefully useful for marketers out there.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that study. I think one of the things that it illustrated is the way you did that study was you didn't do the modeling yourself, did you? You commissioned it from a number of other partners. Am I right? That's that. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes, we did. In fact, we worked with 3 different partners for this research. That included Nielsen, NAPA, and GfK. And we also just recently published new research in collaboration with Kantar and CreativeX on the role of creative in driving short and long-term outcomes using a similar approach, which we are very excited about. It's a great piece of research, so really recommend checking out the report if you want to learn more.
So that was interesting because, and this is a kind of slightly, I don't know, controversial is not quite the right word. Different econometricians, different market mix modelers use different methods, and they don't always agree with one another. So one of the things that you said in that report was the challenge you set these different people was to measure the short and long-term effects of advertising, but they used different ways of doing it. And Gordon talked about some of the methods for measuring. I mean, I think everybody's fairly well agreed on measuring short-term effects, but then I think there's a lot more diversity in methodologies for measuring longer-term effects. So it was quite nice to see. Let's measure this by whatever you think is the best method. Actually, here's a question: to what extent did they agree with one another? That's an interesting point. Was there diversity in the outcomes across those different methodologies?
And I think that was the interesting finding was not in terms of the outcomes. The methodologies that were applied were different. So maybe just very quickly. So there are 2 main approaches that we've used. One is similar to the one Gordon just described, where you would use brand equity or brand outcomes as an indicator for their long-term growth, right? That's very established. And the other way of modeling long-term effects, and there's more to this, is a simplified view on what's possible, but is looking at baseline sales and modeling ad spend on the sales baseline. So there are pros and cons that come with each of those approaches, but they are very different in terms of from a methodology perspective, I would say.
Yeah. So what I find is quite interesting is you're seeing different methods, but similar results. Mm-hmm. And I've actually seen a couple of other studies recently. So back in October, I was at the IPA Effectiveness Conference here in London, and 2 different researchers presented some other studies where they're looking at meta-analyses, again, looking at short-term and long-term effects. One was ThinkBox, their ThinkBox 2 study, which I don't think is yet published. But they concluded on average that long-term effects account for about 60% of the payback, and then short-term effects about 40%, which is the same number that you got. And then there's a new study which will be coming out, I think, towards the end of the year or beginning of the year, which ITV are involved in. Very different methodology, a methodology which I barely understand, frankly. But from my reading of their preliminary findings, they were similarly getting a 60-40 ratio, 60% long-term, 40% short-term. So 3 different studies, each of which uses a range of methodologies and range of suppliers, and all getting to the same number, this 60-40 ratio, which I find absolutely fascinating. And it's a ratio I've seen in my own work.
I would agree less in terms of the consistency, right? There were, like, we've seen a number of studies come out over the last few years on short and long-term impact, and what is striking is almost the consistency in terms of the results, independent of the methodology, country, category. It's fairly consistent. There are nuances, right? In terms of, again, to my point, we found the long-term to be like in between 40 and 70 or 80%, depending on the category. But on average, yes, we found also the 60%. So it seems to be very consistent.
Sorry, go on, Liz.
Go on.
This is what I absolutely love, the consistency here. It's triangulation, calibration across multiple methods. It doesn't just apply to my own measurement framework for Adidas sales. It's kind of all the evidence that we have out there. But I would confess, like, I was a real skeptic to these kind of best practice learnings, 60-40. Oh, it sounds too easy. It sounds too obvious. And especially when you then hear, oh, this study's also saying, this study's also saying, it's like, yeah, there's nothing in that. It can't be real. I had to see it to believe it. And I absolutely have seen it, and so, oh, great, believe me now, there's somebody else saying they believe it. But I think it's almost too misleading that the 60-40 keeps coming out. But to Connie's point and to Liz's works, that everyone should read effectiveness in context, to follow up long short of it. It really shows there is very meaningful and different variation in categories, in product situations, but it does all ladder up to this kind of broader 60-40 guidance as a rule.
I should point out, so what we're talking about here is this 60-40 ratio of 60% of the effect is long-term and 40% of the effect is short-term. The famous 60-40 rule, which has in some ways got me and Peter Field into trouble, which we'll come back to later, is about how much you should spend, which we say it should be about 60-40. But the fact that those two ratios are so similar is interesting, and I think there might be an explanation for it, but we're not there yet. But anyway, we're jumping ahead, I think.
But yeah, let's definitely jump into this subject, actually, because I think the 60-40 is very fascinating, and as you just pointed out, that's the ratio between long-term and short-term effects, and that's often longer-term effects are said to be driven by upper funnel advertising and short-term effects by lower funnel or performance advertising. So some conclude that this should be the ratio. So maybe let's jump into that. How do you see that?
Well, so Peter Field and I, in our book, the long and the short of it, the 2013 book, based on data from the IPA data bank, we came to a tentative conclusion that advertising campaigns were, as a whole, were at their most efficient when about 60% of the budget was spent on long-term brand building and about 40% on short-term activation. Approximately, fairly, and there's lots of margins of error within that. What we then did was we looked at this. We wrote another book called Effectiveness in Context, which was 2018, and we looked at how strategy and budgeting differed for different brands in different categories, different sizes, different price points, and so on. And so our overall conclusion there was, one of the conclusions was that ratio of brand to activation, while it might be 60-40 on average, should be different in different contexts, depending on whether, for example, it's financial services, which tend to need a higher ratio of brand building, or business to business, which need a lower one, or whether you're a young brand, which young brands tend to need more activation, or a mature brand, which those tend to need more brand. So I think maybe I can't even remember whether we called it the 60-40 rule at the beginning, but if we did, I'm so sorry, because the point is it's a starting point for a budget process. If you know nothing else, that's a good place to start. But what you then need to do is to adjust that balance depending on your particular situation, and we give a whole load of guidelines for that. But there's one person in particular, and I guess we all know who it is, who is constantly slagging us off for talking about the idea that there might be a rule.
Thanks for the clarification. And in very general, if we think about, okay, advertisers do upper funnel and lower funnel advertising in some mix. When measuring this with econometrics, what would be your advice as practitioners how to cover both in econometrics?
Well, I'll start with my view. I mean, as I say, everything I learned about this, I learned it around about 1995, 96, working on a small insurance brand. And one of the simplest techniques is to have multiple ad stocks. So you have short and long-term ad stocks. And in fact, the way I like to do it, if possible, is to have short and long-term ad stocks for every single medium. So there's a short-term effect of TV and a long-term effect of TV, a short-term effect of radio and a long-term effect of radio, a short-term effect of a promotion and a longer-term effect of a promotion. It does make things complicated, but I have all those things in. Then one can, as Gordon says, have structural models, which may have, your marketing effects, for example, some tracking measure like positivity towards the brand or something like that, which in turn affects sales. I personally am not a big fan of that technique. Structural models might include direct responses or something. So you might have, that your linear attribution feeds are kind of modeled and built into the model. I'm also quite a big fan of lag-dependent variables. Some people use floating bases, and so on.
Thank you.
But the biggest point for me on this is that there are short and long-term effects immediately measurable, and that's the key thing. It's expecting this. It's not that it's an effect that will only come to fruition in a year's time. Brand activity is influencing some people now. There's some people in category, or some people you've just enticed into the category. So you will be able to measure those green shoots. They're meaningful, and to be honest, quite often a consistent predictor of long-term success as well. So it's, everything Liz described of how to measure it is spot on, and the fact is expect to measure it straight away, although this is where it works when you're applying a consistent measurement methodology like econometrics. The issue it becomes if you're expecting to measure those green shoots straight away through, say, digital attribution, where often you won't even have had a click call to action on your brand activity or anything like that. So it's making sure you're measuring immediately, but through the appropriate method.
A really important point is long-term effects are not delayed effects. They're immediate but long-lasting.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Gordon, I mean, your business is probably maximum complex. You have online sales, you have offline sales, you have your own stores, you have partner stores, you have performance ads, you have brand ads. How do you bring all this together in your framework?
Yeah, I joined Adidas thinking, this is going to be easy. All I'm doing is selling some trainers. That's life's going to be simple moving from the telco world to this. No, it is incredibly complex, and but in a really good way. It's understanding the relationships of everything, the way things feed into each other. First of all, we try and ultimately measure a technique that is aggregate business performance. It's like me, I'm a firm believer in kind of marketing principles of, Yes, I want people to love Adidas. Yes, I want people to buy Adidas, but they will buy it wherever they want it. They'll buy it if it's top of mind. Um, they can buy it on ASOS. They can buy it in Zalando. They can go into JD Sports. Yes, I would love if they come to our website and buy it. The key thing is we want to measure all of these effects together. So the biggest commitment is getting the data in place for all of that granularity that can therefore be matched and modeled in a true apples to apples quality comparison between all of your sources of metrics. So it's getting your data in place is probably one of the biggest things. The other thing is having to therefore then define success in advance of measurement. When you're talking about measuring upper funnel investment, don't expect to measure it in short-term attributed sales. Whereas if you are wanting to evaluate your performance media's activity, absolutely you should have some sort of measure and understanding of incremental outcomes on that. But the biggest thing is communication and education and constantly having that within your business. There's a big principle known as the curse of knowledge, which can make us all sound like, oh, we're experts, we're so good, we're so much better than you. But it's not that. It's about this reality check, this self-awareness of understanding that because you understand something, and often the people you speak to directly might also share that understanding, you assume everybody else has that understanding.
Yeah.
And that becomes such a big challenge of getting successful measurement frameworks like this in place and deployed effectively in an organization.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, you need top-notch modeling, which means, hardcore mathematicians, great data, a lot of creative thinking with the numbers and everything. But it's useless if you can't explain it to people. And this is one of the big weaknesses of, us data nerds. I'm kind of thinking about this podcast and thinking, we're 41 minutes in, I think now, and there'll be a bunch of people going, I don't understand any of what they're talking about. It's really hard sometimes getting this stuff across. You need to be able to do all the analysis and also then tell stories and frame what you've learned in a way that's human and interesting and kind of actionable. It's so hard.
And one of the hardest things as well is often the most impactful stuff is the least impressive and exciting analytical stuff. For instance, one of the most powerful tools of converting non-marketing people to understand the importance of marketing investment is talking about things like share of voice, which doesn't have any real complexity to it. It has massive challenges on accuracy and meaningfulness of data, but the simplicity of share of voice is something that suddenly people just get. So it's you also wrestle with this, like you want to lean into the really smart and intelligence tools that you have, but you shouldn't lose sight of just some other kind of powerful and simpler tools.
Yeah, they're simple and macro, aren't they? And I think there's a sort of personality problem with econometricians, really, isn't there? Often they are very granular thinkers, so they don't like talking about the wood. They want to talk about the trees. They get obsessed with the details, and also they're much more comfortable with numbers than with words or people. So, it is a challenge.
But I think, the audience of this podcast, hopefully we have a lot of marketing scientists who can talk about baseline modeling and nested models and all these kinds of things. But what I liked also about the short and long-term impact of advertising, in the end, you have a very complex mathematical model under the hood, but the outcome is pretty straightforward. You have a short-term ROI plus a long-term ROI, which equals total ROI. So then it gets really simple. So I think that's also something that our industry and our practice should do more to think about. How can we come up with results that are easily understood?
Yeah, I think I've made the latter part of my career has all been about oversimplifying.
I think, the challenge is, or for us is, what is important is to, how do we translate the outcomes into something actionable for marketers as well? And that also, in my view, holds true for when we talk about short and long-term effects, right? Which is certainly more advanced modeling. Yes, we can keep the result simple, but we also want to make it actionable. So to use it to understand what drives short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes, right? So to take that into the organization and make sure it translates into something that, marketing teams can use in their daily job.
Yeah.
Gordon.
I think that's a big point as well. Just making sure we don't get caught up in this kind of. It is quite simple. It ultimately gives you a short-term return on investment, a long-term return on investment. Is let's make sure we're not simplifying it to that. That is not a useful endpoint just to look back and say, did last year's campaign perform better than the year before that? It's making sure you developed a framework that's actually useful for immediate intelligence, and this helps in every respect. It gets buy-in in the organization because you realize it's not just a look back tool, it's a look forward tool, but also ultimately drives your business forwards. So making sure you've measured meaningful relationships with your media to be able to forecast forward, predict the optimal balance of investment that you have, both scale and mix. And unless you're actually doing that, it really does just become a nice to have look back exercise.
100% agreed. And I think that's also why it's so valuable to have multiple solutions and link them. Make sure if we use experiments, that's so powerful. And understanding, the performance levers and then linking that back to the performance and the findings we get in MMM. And in the short and long term, whatever the outcome is that we're looking at in terms of a business outcome, that makes it powerful as a measurement framework. That's how you get the most out of your measurement, I would argue.
That's a great conclusion for this podcast.
We can't stop.
45 minutes.
I want to talk about randomized controlled trials.
We've just started.
So much more to say.
Actually, I couldn't agree more. This was a super interesting conversation, and there are really many, many more topics we could cover in this group. So maybe let's reconnect and do another episode next year. For now, thanks so much for joining and sharing your wisdom. I found it very inspiring, and of course, I hope it was as relevant for our audience. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If you found it interesting, please subscribe, share, and of course, stay tuned for the next episodes of this podcast. Bye.